let's move on then in the next part of our presentation today and talk about data. Of course, as medical researchers, data are often the first thing that we would collect. And it's important then to think about the difference between data collection and data presentation. And we would use analyses of different kinds, statistical analyses, for example, which are, of course, an essential component of academic research, a must-have skill for any researcher. Also useful, of course, in commercial, industry, and business settings. And we will talk in a minute about data presentation because, of course, key skills in data presentation help you to communicate your results more clearly and effectively as you tell the story of your research. So often when you finish a project, data are the first thing that you end up with. And we think about sampling, we think about what kinds of sampling will we use to interrogate our data, to understand the difference between the trends and the probability versus non-probability sampling in our data. And don't worry, we will give you a video presentation of this webinar today. So some of the content on the slides, some of the writing on the slides, some of the information on some of these slides you'll be able to come back to and have a look at again in your own time in the future. And I would say that in medical research in particular, let's have a think about what the differences are between qualitative and quantitative variables and how we assign or not numerical values to these different pieces of data. Are we collecting discrete data? Are we collecting categorical data, nominal, ordinal, or continuous data? Because, of course, how we present and how we analyze these different kinds of data can also be important. And we summarize data. We think about how the records of each value of the variable may occur. And this is the nuts and bolts of any medical research. Presenting your data effectively to the reader is absolutely key in order to get your message across in an easy to understand, accessible manner. Because don't forget that we are writing articles for a range of different stakeholders, government policymakers, other researchers, interested members of the public. So how we summarize sets of observations, how we show our statistics, how we present our outcomes, absolutely critical in order to be believed. And we have a huge responsibility as medical researchers to not be misleading, to not go too far with our data, to be responsible in the way in which we present our analyses. Correlation, of course, does not imply cause. We know this, but so often in medical research, analyses can be flawed, retractions can happen. We'll talk about this in a minute in the later section of this presentation today. And we worry about the misleading influence of third variables, spurious correlations of a part with the whole, and in particular when we combine unlike populations of data together. Again, we will present next month in our Diffusion Editing Bentham Science webinar series a full presentation on data analysis. If you're interested in attending that presentation, if you would like more information on how you can effectively analyze and present your data, we will give you access to that presentation later in this webinar itself. I will now introduce you to one of my favorite papers of all time, Data Presentation, 10 Simple Rules for Better Figures. An article, a fantastic article, published in 2014 in PLOS Computational Biology. We're going to go through 10 simple rules for data presentation, which I think are incredibly useful for any academic researchers, but in particular, medical researchers who are presenting data that people need to understand easily at first glance when looking at somebody else is article. Rule number 1, know your audience. Who's going to be reading the study? How you present your data to your audience is absolutely critical. Identify your message. How you bring across the message in your figures, in your data, is key to understanding. I encourage you, have a look at this PLOS computational biology article. It doesn't matter if the figures are in beautiful color. It doesn't matter if the figures are in black and white. How you present the data, how you identify your message can be very important as you also adapt to the medium. Have a look at these two examples presenting the same data. Which would be more appropriate for an academic article in terms of non-confusing academic data, research data presentation? I put it to you that the figure on the right-hand side of this slide, as you look at the screen, would be more appropriate and less confusing for the reader in an academic article setting. Captions are not an option. Often, people download papers and they take out the figures. Often people only look at the figures in academic articles. So you have to put all the information necessary into the caption of your figure so that somebody else is able to get all that information when they take just the figure off the journal website or when they download just the figure from the PDF. And I would also say, rule number 5, very important, make sure you understand how to use the software that you use yourself for making your figures. Don't be swayed by colleagues, by friends who tell you that you have to use this particular software package. Use drawing software packages that you are comfortable with and develop a style for your figure presentation that will be consistent between your articles. People will look at your papers and they will think that's an article by this person. The style is consistent across a series of papers. Use your color effectively. And again, have a look at these 3 different presentations of the same data. Which one is clearer? Which one is more effective? Which one sells the data, sells the interpretation to the audience most effectively? And don't mislead. This is absolutely critical, as we've talked about in medical research. The scale in these 2 ways of presenting the same data is different. We're using the disk area in the black versus the disk radius in the red. And which of these 2 graphs is correct? Of course, you should be presenting the data and giving your audience the relative size using the full range of the data. Of course, if you plot just a partial range, as done here in the red example, then it looks a lot more significant to the reader than the data actually is. We have huge responsibility as medical researchers to make sure that we are not misleading people. Avoid junk. Here again, you can see the same data plotted for the reader in 2 different ways. Of course, it doesn't matter about the color. The figure presentation on the right-hand side of the screen, as you look here, is easier for the reader to understand. So those are the kinds of issues that you can think about when you start to present your data to readers and submit your articles to journals. Thirdly, as we discussed, we will now talk a little bit about some of the very specific ethical issues that we face as medical researchers when we are putting together our articles. Ethics, of course, helps us decide what we should do and also in our published research work. And this is important for medical researchers because, of course, we are informing government policy. Let's think about the pharmaceutical industry for a minute, major doer and sponsor of research. It is important then that we have integrity in all aspects of the research process and research funding. And we find in our medical journals that when you do ethical work, when you do intervention-based work or trial-based work on human subjects, you must register those trials prospectively. You must register before you start the experiment, before you start the intervention. So often, one of the biggest causes for rejection in the medical literature, authors coming to journals with work that involves interventions or trials on human subjects that have not been registered before the work began. So think about this as an issue in your own research. Of course, this is the way that it should work. We collaborate, we get our articles submitted, and we get our research articles published. But there are steps along the way where authors, researchers fall foul, often by no fault of their own, in terms of publication ethics and understanding the publishing process. Again, this is an issue that we're going to come back to and talk about again in our future presentations, but do you have a clear understanding of what the ethical requirements are for the research that you are doing in your particular area? Have a look at your target journals. We again can help if that is something that is of interest to you, because you do not want to be in the situation where you have to retract a paper that you've published in a journal. Retractions, of course, are a serious issue, and we see an increasing number of them over recent decades. The number of retraction notices published by journals up to 2009 shot up, as you can see on this graph, and it has to do with the pressure that authors feel to get their research published in leading journals as fast as possible. So being aware of ethical issues, in particular in your own specific research field, is key in order to avoid problems down the road in the future. And I just give you a few examples of this kind of thing, because it gets into the media, and this is the last thing that you want as a researcher, to get your work covered by the media in a negative way. So again, let me emphasize that we can help you to prevent ethical issues in the publication of your research by providing better author education, by helping authors around the world to understand what's happening at the journals that they submit their work to, what kinds of guidelines those journals have, what kinds of issues, what kinds of things are expected by leading international journals when you put work into those journals for the peer review process. One key issue, as we've already mentioned, is the registration of studies involving interventions or trials on human subjects. These have to be registered before you start the work. We get lots of submissions at the journals that I work with, Taylor and Francis, journals where authors have retrospectively registered their ethical trial guidelines, their ethical reports from their institutions. This has happened after the work was started, and often international journals will just reject articles if that's the case. So clearer guidelines are needed. And of course, if you use preprint services, as we've talked about already, then your colleagues, other people in the field, can comment on your work, can help you with these kinds of issues. And journals can come to you and ask you about your work, whether it would be suitable for publication in their particular journal, in their particular outlet, and the editors will ask you specific questions, of course, about the ethics. So what we do at our company and in collaboration with colleagues at Bentham Science is that we try to educate people and give people information about the process, the publication process. We provide roadmaps for publishing, so preparing to write, things to think about before you start to write, selling yourself, capturing an editor's attention, writing with a clear structure so that you and the editor do not get lost, and of course, effective writing. There are some simple rules that you can follow that will make a huge difference to your writing. So, in summary, let's think about what we've talked about in this presentation today. We've talked about starting to write, and we've talked about some tricks that you can apply in your writing for success. We've talked about what comes first in a medical article in terms of data presentation and being effective in the way that you put your data together and transmit that to your audience. And then thirdly, we've talked about ethical issues, in particular in medical research, the main reasons that articles get turned away from some leading international medical journals. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation today, the point of this is to help you to be more effective as a writing and publishing academic. So let me say thank you very much for listening to this presentation. Today we have a discount code that you can use at our Diffusion editing website. And again, let me emphasize that this has been a presentation jointly with our colleagues at Bentham Science, publishers of open access and hybrid journals and ebooks. Have a look at the Bentham Science website, and I'm sure that you will find journals there that would be particularly suitable for your next publication. My name is Gareth Dyke. Thank you one and all for listening, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next Diffusion Bentham joint presentation. Have a great day wherever you're listening from in the world.